2 billion euros. Vanished. Not stolen, not lost, never existed. In 2020, Wirecard was Germany's tech crown jewel, bigger than Deutsche Bank in valuation, the darling of the DAX index. They processed payments for Visa, MasterCard, Apple Pay. The auditors called them innovative. The regulators called them compliant. The CEO called himself a visionary. Then the money disappeared. The auditors admitted they never checked. The CEO fled to Russia. And a journalist who warned them had his car bombed. This isn't accounting fraud. This is a national humiliation. Welcome to the Autopsy. This is Wirecard. To understand the collapse, meet the illusionists who built the ghost. Markus Braun, CEO, former KPMG consultant. The aesthetic of Silicon Valley, black turtlenecks, TED Talks, disruption. He wasn't a coder, he was a storyteller. And Germany, desperate for a tech champion, bought the story. John Marsalek, COO, the operational genius. He ran the Asian operations, the part of Wirecard that supposedly generated half the revenue. He spoke 6 languages, charmed regulators, and had connections to Austrian intelligence and Russian oligarchs. He would later flee on a private jet to Minsk, then disappear. Wirecard began in 1999, payment processing for porn and gambling, high-risk, high-fee merchants that banks avoided. They built real technology, real licenses, real early growth. Then came the pivot. 2010. Wirecard claimed they had acquired payment processors across Asia, India, Philippines, Singapore. Revenue exploded, profits soared. The stock price rose 800% in 5 years. But there was a problem. The Asian acquisitions were shells, empty offices, forged contracts, phantom revenue. Wirecard wasn't processing payments in Asia. They were drawing money from German banks against fake receivables, cycling it through offshore accounts, and calling it profit. The body looked like a fintech unicorn. It was a wire transfer loop with a website. Let's dissect the pathology. Wirecard didn't hide the fraud well. They hid it in plain sight, and Germany chose not to see. First, the phantom escrow accounts. Wirecard claimed they held 1.9 billion euros in trust accounts at 2 Philippine banks, BDO and BPI. This was the collateral for their entire Asian operation. The money supposedly sat there, safe, liquid, ready to backstop transactions. It didn't exist. The banks had never heard of Wirecard. The account documents were forged. The signatures were fake. The 1.9 billion euros was a spreadsheet entry, backed by nothing but confidence. Second, the auditor capture. Ernst & Young, EY, audited Wirecard for years. They signed off on the financials. They never independently verified the Philippine accounts, never called the banks directly, never asked why a German company kept its crown jewels in Southeast Asian institutions no one had heard of. When journalists at the Financial Times, Dan McCrum and Paul Murphy, started asking questions in 2015, Wirecard's response wasn't transparency. It was lawfare. They hired private investigators to follow the journalists. They filed criminal complaints in Germany. They convinced the regulator, BaFin, to investigate the journalists for market manipulation instead of investigating Wirecard for fraud. BaFin, the German financial regulator, issued a short-selling ban on Wirecard stock, protecting the company from speculators, while the company was a vacuum. Third, the COO's double life. Jan Marsalek wasn't just running fake Asian operations. He was meeting with Libyan intelligence. He was claiming to have contacts in the British SAS. He was wiring millions to shell companies in Dubai and the British Virgin Islands. He was living in a Vienna apartment paid for by Wirecard, throwing parties with escorts and intelligence operatives, while telling the board he was closing deals in Manila. Fourth, the whistleblowers. They existed. A Singapore employee found forged contracts in 2016. A Philippines lawyer warned that the escrow accounts were fiction. A London executive quit rather than sign off on the Asian numbers. Wirecard fired them, sued them, or paid them silence money. The system was designed to eject truth. The disease was nationalistic vanity. Germany wanted a tech giant. Wirecard gave them the performance. The auditors performed, The regulators performed, the stock market performed. The only thing real was the lie, and it grew 2 billion euros large. The bleeding started with a spreadsheet. June 2020. EY finally demanded proof of the Philippine accounts. Wirecard produced it. EY checked with the banks. The bank said, "We have no relationship with Wirecard. These documents are forged." The revelation was atomic. June 18, 2020. Wirecard admits the 1.9 billion euros probably doesn't exist. The stock collapses 80% in hours. June 22. Markus Braun resigns, then gets arrested. June 25. Wirecard files for insolvency. The first DAX 30 company ever to do so. John Marsalek disappears. He flies from Austria to Belarus on a private jet. He sends voice messages to colleagues claiming he's negotiating with the Russian government. He is last seen in Minsk. Interpol issues a red notice. He is never found. Some say he's in Moscow, some say he's dead. The 2 billion euros is never found either. The autopsy was brutal. The German parliament investigates. EY faces criminal charges. BaFin's president resigns. The auditors who signed off on Wirecard's books for a decade claim they were deceived. The deception was, no one called a bank. The victims were real. Wirecard processed payments for legitimate businesses, travel companies, retailers, startups. When the company collapsed, their money froze. Some went bankrupt. Employees lost jobs. Investors lost 20 billion euros in market value. The German taxpayer funded bailouts and investigations. The final irony: Wirecard's actual technology worked. The payment processing was real. The fraud was a side business, a fictional Asian empire grafted onto a legitimate European operation. They didn't need the lie. They chose it. Markus Braun awaits trial in Munich, claiming he was deceived by Marsalek. Marsalek is a ghost. The 2 billion euros is a number that never was. And Germany, Europe's most rigorous economy, learned that its regulators could be blinded by the desire to win. The Y incision, the precise cut that reveals cause of death, points to 2015, the first Financial Times article. When Dan McCrum found the empty Manila office, the forged contracts, the whistleblowers. When he published proof that Wirecard's Asian empire was fiction. Wirecard didn't refute with facts. They refuted with lawyers, private investigators, and regulatory capture. BaFin investigated the journalist. The DAX index kept Wirecard. The auditors kept signing. The stock kept rising. That was the kill shot, not the fraud itself, the decision to protect the fraud from scrutiny. The autopsy proves Wirecard was dead in 2015. Every year after was just the nervous system firing in a corpse that Germany refused to bury. The incision reveals the horror. They knew. EY knew the Philippine accounts were suspicious. BaFin knew the short-selling ban was protecting a lie. The board knew Marsalek was a fiction. They chose the performance over the autopsy. The disease was cowardice. The unwillingness to admit that Germany's tech champion was a mirage. The fear that killing Wirecard would kill German innovation. So they kept it breathing with ventilators, loans, regulatory protection, auditor silence, until the corpse exploded. The lesson of Wirecard is universal and terrifying. When a company becomes a national symbol, it becomes immune to scrutiny. When auditors are paid by the audited, they audit nothing. When regulators become cheerleaders, they regulate no one. Wirecard didn't hide in shadows. It stood in the spotlight, and the spotlight blinded everyone who should have looked closer. The 2 billion euros was a spreadsheet cell. The cell was never checked. The checking was never required. In business, verification is not paranoia. When someone says, "Trust me, the money is safe," the only correct response is, "Show me the bank statement. Now." This was the profit autopsy. Next case, Crypto.com.